This is COMD 400, Lecture 1, Introductory but highly important concepts. Lecture 1 is divided into 4 lecture casts, parts 1, 2, 3, and 4. The slide set that you have is numbered from number 1 to approximately number 55. Part 1 covers slides 1 through 17. COMD 400 Hearing Science has as its course description the coverage of anatomy, parts, physiology, function of the auditory system, and as well covers disorders of the auditory system, or we might otherwise call pathology of the auditory system. Hearing is the focus of this class, sort of what it is that allows us to have this experience of hearing. Hearing is one of our senses. Hearing allows us to detect certain environmental events. Essentially, that's what all of our senses allow us to do. We'll see this more in slides 7 and 8 in just a few moments here. But hearing allows us to detect certain environmental events, certain energies, really. And the first sort of pop quiz, first question here is where is hearing? Where does hearing happen? And if you said hearing occurs in your ears, well, you're sort of close, but not really. Hearing really happens in your brain. That's where hearing occurs. Our ears allow us to hear. Our ears change energy and then deliver it to your brain. So without your ears, you wouldn't hear. But the sensation of hearing actually occurs in your brain. And when we look at a left lateral view of the brain, again, you can see here's the person's nose over here. So this would be front or anterior over this way. This is posterior or toward the back over there. And so you can see the arrow that's already on the screen pointing to where the region for hearing is occurring. This part of the brain is called the temporal lobe, generally said, in through here. This is all kind of the boundaries of the temporal lobe, and through this this whole area there. And this aspect here, this area that's already identified, is what's referred to as the primary auditory cortex. Not coincidentally, I mean, for real, right next door to the auditory cortex, in fact, is the area called Wernicke's area. I'm just going to abbreviate that WA, which is the area of the brain that's primarily responsible for comprehension of auditory language. So it's no surprise that the primary auditory receptive area in the brain is basically the next door neighbor of the part of the brain that allows us to comprehend oral language. All of our senses, really any and all of our senses, have the same purpose, which is to take a stimulus, to take energy from the environment and to change it, to translate that into something that your brain can process. And basically our brains process neural signals, but the best way to kind of think about that is our brains process electrical signals. Anything that's traveling along neural, which is another way of saying along a nerve, anything that's traveling along a nerve is propagating with an electrical signal. So whatever it is that's out in the environment, we call it, for lack of a better word, we call it sound. That energy has to be converted some way or another into an electrical signal so that your brain can process it. That's fundamentally what's going on with that. These neural electrical signals are really based on minute chemical changes, but they are in fact little sparks of electricity we call voltages that are traveling along the nerves and so on. So it's these bursts of electricity that get to the brain that allows you to sort of get some sense and some experience relative to what happened in the environment. And we have this is true for all of our senses. And so we think about the senses, and we have this notion of exteroception, meaning what are we able to perceive outside of our body. We've got sense of smell, sense of touch, sense of taste, sight, hearing, and I'm going to throw in here as well the sense of balance. The reason I'm going to do that is that both the hearing and the balance organs are part of the anatomy of the ear, specifically the inner ear. And we'll see that when we get to that discussion later on in the course. Part of what I'm also contemplating here when we think about what our senses are, especially these sort of 4 or 5 or 6 senses here, is that all of these have dedicated receptor cells that are distinct for the energy that are distinct for the energy involved. So the receptors that are responsible for vision would not work for hearing. The receptors that are responsible for touch would not work for taste. These are all dedicated, specialized receptors that are specific for a particular type of energy. This also should make you think that we don't pick up all of the energies of the world, all of the energies of the universe. We only pick up some energies, and we only pick up with our receptive structures, and we only pick up those energies within certain ranges. So we have, in many respects, we have a limited capacity to sense what's happening in the world. All senses allow any organism that possesses them, so this is sort of a across the animal kingdom kind of thing. All animals, your senses allow those animals to interact with the environment. And if we think about it on an animal level, to help the animal engage in their basic life processes, to find food, to escape becoming food, to find shelter, and to find a mate. So our most basic survival kinds of things is what your senses allow you to do. Let's compare a couple of these just to have some background and perspective on these. When we think about touch and taste as a sense, both of these require that the actual source of the stimulus directly engage the sensory receptors. And that's not true for the other 5 classic senses. So in order for you to have the sense of touch, there's got to be something laid on you. In order for you to taste something, there's got to be some food product or chemical in your mouth that would actually come in contact with your sensory receptors. For these latter senses, so excluding touch and taste, but if we think about the remaining ones, hearing, sight, and smell, the source of the stimulus can be distant from the sensory receptors. And in this context, then, the stimulus has to travel through the environment in order to engage the sensory receptor. The traveling through the environment, more often than not, is going to cause some degrading of the stimulus, of its amplitude for sure, but and also add some possible other contaminants to that. But the key notion here is that for the senses of hearing, sight, and smell, that these are distance receptors. These are things that allow you to perceive and to experience something that's happening away from your body, not on your body. If we compare hearing to touch and taste, and just ask the question, what's different regarding hearing when compared to touch and taste? The answer is that touch and taste are direct receptors, whereas hearing is a distance receptor. What do hearing and sight have in common? Well, in this case, both are distance receptors. There are obviously distinctions between hearing and sight, and in fact, we always think about how they work together. But what they have, in fact, in common is that they both allow us to perceive a stimulus that's happening away from our bodies. Think about this from a security point of view. If you are on a trail hiking in our foothills here, how would it be that you would like to detect that there was a bear on the trail ahead of you? Certainly, tactile or touch sensation would probably not be the most ideal way to do it, but seeing that bear, hearing the sounds of the bear would allow you then this distance to be able to then flee and to find yourself safety in this context. If we compare hearing to sight, we can think about ultimately these things are going to work together, and they're going to be what we call complementary senses. And so what hearing sort of gives us gives us some things that sight doesn't. Sight gives us some things that hearing doesn't. And so if we think here for the moment, how is hearing slightly better, or what is it about hearing that's better when we compare it to sight? The answers are probably pretty obvious. Hearing works in the dark. Vision does not. Hearing works around and through barriers. It's very difficult to see someone who's on the other side of a door if you can't see through the door naturally, through like a hole or something like that. And hearing works while you're asleep. And in that sense, your hearing is never really shut off. Your hearing is sort of constantly monitoring the environment. And then, some of you that have been in experience where you're asleep and all of a sudden there's a novel, loud sound out in the alley behind your house, a garbage can getting knocked over, an animal screaming, or whatever the case may be. It wakes you up. And not only when you're awoken, it's not that you're just awake, but you're completely activated. Your survival activation has occurred. Your adrenal glands are pumping adrenaline, and your heart is beating fast, and you're breathing fast, and so on. And you're out of a deep sleep sort of instantaneously. And that's because of your auditory system is monitoring everything, and then detected something, and at a very primitive level provided you with a animal level kind of fight or flight kind of response. What do sense organs do? Sense organs, regardless of the modality, so this would be true for vision as much as it would be for hearing, collect and receive information. They modify it somehow. They analyze it somehow. And for our purposes, convert that information. This process of conversion is really an important aspect of this particular course. So in order to get all of this work done, sense organs have specialized sensory cells that we can say are energy specific. So the eyes are specific for photoelectric energy. The auditory system is specific for acoustic energy. And the receptors for one will not work very efficiently for those other energies. So one of the key concepts of this class is this notion of energy conversion. We have a special term that we're going to want to use and kind of consider here, and if we're learning it for the first time, that's great too, and that's this notion of transduction. The conversion of energy from one form to another is called transduction, and the sense organs that do this are called transducers. So something that changes energy from one form into another form of energy is a transducer. So that would be the definition of what is a transducer. Transducer is something that changes energy from one form to another. By basically definition, then sense organs and the auditory system particularly is a type of series of transducers where energy is converted into different kinds of energy so that it can ultimately be perceived by the brain. So this concept of transduction is really critical. The auditory system is a series of transducers, and ultimately remember that energy that's in the world is an acoustic energy, is sound, and somehow or another that's got to get converted into an electrical energy, into an electrical signal, so that your brain can process it and understand it. This does not happen in one stage. It happens in a sequence or a series of transducers. And to really understand how the auditory system works in terms of its complexity, we need to sort of know and understand transducers, at least on a kind of a basic level, to kind of get a sense of, well, what's really kind of happening with how energy is being changed. This brings us to slide 17, which is the last slide in this first screencast. Summary of part 1. You should be now able to state some of the advantages that hearing provides when compared to other senses. So think about hearing hearing as compared to sorry for that. We'll get that better. Hearing compared to vision. Let me get my pen back. Hearing compared to vision, how is it better? Hearing compared to any of the other touch or taste, this to say the distance versus the non-distance senses. Explain why. You should be now able to explain why environmental stimuli have to be translated into a neural electrical code. And the simple answer is because the brain only processes things that are neural and electrical. And the energies of the world have to be converted into the types of energy, neural electrical kinds of energies, in order for the brain to process it. And you should now also be able to define both transducer and transduction. So on that, we will leave part 1, and I will pick this up again in lecture 1, part 2.